Hi, my name's John Moore. I'm a Cerec dentist and a Cerec trainer in the UK. My brother Paul Moore is also a Cerec trainer and he works in Ireland. But we'd like to talk you through how to mill more than one restoration from a single Cerec block. Okay. Now, isn't it frustrating when you design your Cerecs and you mill them? You pick out a porcelain block from your storage system, and by the time the restoration has been created, you've probably got half or more of your block left. So we're going to show you how you can reuse the same block to create a second restoration. Now, obviously this is going to save you a lot of time and a lot of money, but we're also going to show you that if you use the right system for storing your blocks, you can make this easy to organise and you can still use all these spare blocks. If you're really lucky, you've kept your old blocks in a cupboard somewhere and you'll be able to get them out and save yourself a lot more money. Typically, if you're milling small restorations such as lower anterior veneers or perhaps small inlays, you'll maybe just get 2 of those from a size 12 block. Whereas these 2 lower anterior crowns, obviously slightly larger than veneers, they required a size 14 block. Here's a case of Paul's where he's made 3 anterior veneers from size 14 blocks. This is part of a case of 6 in total. So we've got here 5 veneers and 1 crown, all milled from the same 3 size 14 blocks. Here again is a lower anterior veneer case, 8 lower anterior veneers milled from 4 size 14 blocks. Here are 2 very narrow premolars, they were less than 6mm each, and I've just got those out of a size 14 block, whereas the next case the 2 premolars were a bit larger than 6mm and I needed 2 blocks for those. And here's how it's done. We'll look at a case of premolar crowns in a size 14 block. Here's the first of the crowns, and the software by default tries to place the crown right at the end of the block, so that as soon as the milling process starts, the crown is actually being manufactured. And it will also try and place the sprue away from the contact areas. However, this is using up more than half of my size 14 block. So what I'm going to do is go to the Tools menu, and then move the sprue and place it on the mesial or distal aspect of the tooth. And then the software will reposition the crown within the block. And I've now got more than half the block available. The only problem with this is it might muck up my contact areas. So if I wish to, I've got the choice of rotating the block slightly to move it away from the contact area, or if I'm not too worried, I can leave it where it was. It's useful sometimes to put your display objects on and show the actual model. Then you can see where the contact point actually is and make sure your sprue is just away from there. So I can go ahead and start milling this crown, and then I'll show you what happens with the milling process. Because this is understanding this is key to making the second restoration work. So when the milling process starts, the first thing the software does is instruct the burrs to feel for the edges of the block and also for the chuck. So it's checking that the block's correctly seated, and it's also checking that the block's the correct size. Now once it's done that, crucially it checks where the end of the block is. So that tells it what size the block is. Now it will start the milling process. So at the end of the milling process we should have our premolar crown and hopefully a block that looks like the lower of these 2 blocks. In other words, more than half of the block is still available. Now the crucial thing to notice here is that in the middle of that block there is a small blob of porcelain, and also that milling area is slightly concave. Now you might be concerned about how this might affect the second restoration, but actually it's not a problem, as I'll show you. So here's the second premolar ready to be milled. Again, the software's put it at the end of the block. And Logic tells us that perhaps we should move this restoration to the other end of the block where the porcelain remains. In fact, we don't. In fact, you leave it where it is, and you'll see why in a moment. So put it back to the far end of the block, but just nudge it in a fraction, maybe 1/4 of a millimetre, something like that. There we go. Okay, so that's ready to be milled now. We'll press the milling button and see what happens. Again, the software makes the burrs feel the size of the block and size of the chuck, make sure that the block is seated correctly. But crucially, when it comes to feeling for the end of the block, the right-hand burr goes in between the two walls of remaining porcelain and actually misses that little nipple in the middle, the blob of porcelain, and goes into the concave area. So it does actually measure the remaining part of the block. Now, if there isn't actually enough room left in the block, the burr will measure the end of the block, and then a warning will come up. The red light will come on in the chamber and the milling process will stop. Okay, there's our red light, and on the screen of the MCXL you'll see that it's telling me the selected block is too small. This is the block battler board that was designed by my brother Paul in Ireland, and this enables me to store as many blocks as I like. I keep them in rows. And each row is a different shade. At one end I have size 12, another end size 14. So I can use this block in any way. I've got my Emax blocks here. So it's a great organising system. You can have as many of these boards as you want on the wall, depends on how many types of block you want to stock. But the key is that I can use this system to help me store the used blocks and know what shade and size they were. So here in my block butler board I've got a row of 2M1C size 14 blocks, and I keep them all in the same row, and then perhaps I'll have a space, and there you'll see at the end there are 2 blocks that have already been milled. So even though the writing is missing from those blocks where they've been milled and I can't identify the size or the colour, as long as I've put them in the correct row, I know both the size and I know the shade, so I can use them again if ever I wish to create a second restoration. And it's as simple as that. Here's a molar inlay, MOD inlay. It's fairly thin, and if you're prepared to move the sprue onto the fitting surface, which is obviously a compromise, but it's up to you, then you will probably get more than one inlay from one block. Looking now at the size of the blocks, here's a size 12 block. They're only about 15, just over 15 mil long, and realistically you're probably only going to get 2 lower anterior veneers from a size 12 block. I'll give you some easy guidelines in a minute, but if you want to measure your restoration, you can do it at the design stage or the milling stage. In the milling stage, use your display objects to turn the block off, and then use your distance measuring tool to measure a full crown, for instance, from one side to the other. It's extremely accurate and very helpful. If you're trying to do the same thing with a veneer, it's a little bit more awkward because the veneer is presented at a strange angle sometimes. Again, try turning the block off. The problem here is that when you try and use the distance tool, it'll take a point at one end of the veneer. There, but then it won't go into mid-air. It won't help you to measure the true width. It'll only measure a point along that veneer. So the only other way you can do it, in fact, is to turn the block back on. And then measure along the side of, measure again. Now be a little careful here, it's not a true measurement because what the software actually does is measure along the glass block. And if you look at this from a different angle, you'll see what I mean. And you don't get a true measurement at all. I think there's a bit of parallax comes into play, so what you think you're measuring isn't actually the truth. It's really worth getting some of these digital calipers. They're very cheap, very easy to get hold of online, and they're extremely accurate. Okay, a size 14 block is about 18mm long. So how does that work when we're trying to get 2 restorations? We've got about, well, you can check the maths of this later, but we've got about 17mm of usable porcelain. For each sprue you're going to need about 2.5mm, so that's 5mm for 2 sprues, which leaves you with about 12mm of porcelain for 2 restorations. So I guess you can break that down and maybe have 2 restorations of 6mm each, or 2 restorations of different sizes. But when you're busy and you're working, you don't really want to be thinking about this stuff too much. You don't want to be spending lots of time measuring. So use these guidelines, write them down, perhaps stick them on a wall or whatever. But if you use these guidelines, they seem to be working quite well for me, and they make life a bit easier. Now this really is not an exact science at all. Here, for instance, is a upper incisor full crown and a small lower anterior veneer that I managed to mill from an Empress multi-block. When I tried to mill exactly the same restorations from the Empress CAD block above it, I could only get the crown. I couldn't get the veneer to mill as well. So it can be very frustrating if you're trying to save a bit of money on the blocks and then find that the red warning light comes on and you've got to go and put another block in and waste a bit of time. So it's not always straightforward, I'm afraid. I'm hoping that somebody far cleverer than I will come up with some better guidelines and work out exactly how it all works. The easiest cases to use this technique on are multiple veneer cases, because always you'll get 2 veneers from a single block. But if you're milling just a single restoration and trying to decide what to do with the remaining block, perhaps you or your nurse can just measure that block and then use this little guide to decide how to store it. I'm putting my blocks into one of 4 categories. Maybe it'll change over time, maybe I'll just have 3 categories, but it seems to be working reasonably well. So there's a little bit of learning and a bit of practicing to do, but if you follow the guidelines towards the end of this talk, I hope you'll find it all pretty simple. It'd be great if you could find a minute just to email myself or my brother Paul. Just let us know what you thought of this and if you felt that the techniques can be improved in any way. Donate a little bit of the money that you think you might save to this fantastic charity. They do incredible work. It would make a big difference to some of these kids, and also to the fantastic clinicians and supporting staff who give up their time to go and help these poor children. My staff tick a box on a small chart that we keep next to the milling machine, a small spreadsheet, and effectively at the end of every month they tot up how many blocks we've successfully reused, and we send a small donation to this charity. I'll very happily send you a copy of that spreadsheet if that's going to help you. And it's good for our team, it's good for the morale of the practice, and obviously good for the charity. So thanks for listening. I hope it's been of benefit and of interest, and I look forward to hearing from you. Thanks a lot.